The 1980s were generally unkind to sports cars and really cars in general. But yet, General Motors soldiered on, introducing what would be one of the most beautiful designs, at least I think, of the 1980s, the 1982 Pontiac Firebird SE and Trans Am models. Introduced in the fall of 1981, this Firebird shrank from a 108-inch wheelbase to a 101-inch wheelbase and lost about 8 inches in overall length. Because of the length reductions as well as engineering specifically designed to trim weight from the vehicle, the car did lose about 500 pounds from its 1981 predecessor. It also became much more aerodynamic and was Pontiac's most aerodynamic Firebird produced to date, with an overall drag coefficient of 0.34 for the Trans Am. This was Pontiac's most aerodynamic Firebird to date and quite a low drag coefficient for the time. And just a few years later, Pontiac designers and engineers would take this aerodynamic efficiency to a new level. In 1985, the Trans Am would be the most aerodynamic car ever released from General Motors, with a 0.29 coefficient of drag. While some level of aerodynamics testing did occur on previous generation models, General Motors by this point had completed its own on-site, full-size wind tunnel at the General Motors Technical Center, and many of the vehicles developed in the 1980s benefited from this new building in which GM could perform its own testing. And the Firebird was no exception. More specifically, the new Firebird had a very low front end, featuring split grills on either side of the fascia, which generally fed some air into the radiator, but most of that came from an air dam that was underneath the bumper, meant to deflect air up into the radiator. Moreover, just about everything on the exterior was designed for aerodynamic efficiency, including the newly pointy side view mirrors, as well as the flush glass, hidden windshield wipers, and even the bowling ball hubcaps. Another element adding to the car's aerodynamic efficiency, as well as helping differentiate it from its sister, the Camaro, were its pop-up headlights. The Firebird's beautiful shape was created in John Chinella's studio at General Motors, and John had quite an interesting background, different from many designers at the time. Whereas most automotive designers in this time came out of Art Center College in Pasadena, California, Chinella ended up attending the University of New Hampshire and also the New England School of Art in Boston, now part of Suffolk University. Chinella eventually hired into General Motors in 1961 at a time where GM was trying to look for diversity in its design candidates. He ended up being one of 3 individuals who joined General Motors in a bit of a non-traditional way, including future Oldsmobile design chief Len Casillo, as well as George Gallion, who went on to head up Opel Design. In spite of these 3 not having the traditional background, all 3 were hired by General Motors and went on to highly successful careers leading design studios for the company. Before landing as Pontiac design chief, Chinella worked in the Cadillac studio where he helped design the taillights on the 1965 Cadillac and also worked on some very seminal Chevrolets after that point, including the Mako Shark II concept, the 1967 Camaro, and the 1968 Corvette. After that, John left for Australia. When he would repatriate to the U.S., John was made head of Pontiac exterior design, where he began work on a number of vehicles, and later the 1982 Firebird, SE, and Trans Am. As the car was launched in 1982, product planners shifted from the previous 4 versions of the Firebird, which in 1981 included the Standard Coupe, the Esprit, the Formula, and the Trans Am, to just 3 variations: the Standard Coupe, the SE hatchback, and then the Trans Am. The Standard Firebird Coupe was meant to be the entry vehicle for the time and to suck in the value-conscious buyer with a base price just under $8,000 at $7,996 for the vehicle. The brochure stated that this entry-level Firebird combined, quote, super sleek excitement with affordability, although it's not quite clear what the definition of excitement was, as this vehicle came standard with a 2.5-liter, 90-horsepower Iron Duke 4-cylinder underhood. That's right, for the first time, the Firebird could be had with a 90-horsepower 4-cylinder. One up from the base Firebird was the SE, which Pontiac called its, quote, most sophisticated Firebird making a subtle contemporary statement with its striking aerodynamic design, special accent paint, and beautiful body-colored turbo-cast aluminum alloy wheels. The SE did come standard with the 1982 only Viscount luxury bucket seats, which are also optional on the Trans Am, and also came with a 2.8-liter V6 engine making 105 horsepower. Very peppy. You could, in the SE, also get the 2.5-liter four-cylinder as a credit option. But the top dog for 1982's Firebird lineup was the Trans Am, which came with, as previously mentioned, a 0.34 drag coefficient, which was GM's best drag coefficient in any production car it offered to date. This particular Trans Am, however, was unfortunately lacking in the underhood horsepower department. While in 1981, you could get a top dog 200 horsepower Pontiac 301 cubic inch V8, by 1982, the top dog engine was a 165 horsepower Chevrolet 305 cubic inch V8, topped with none other than the Crossfire injection. One down from that was the standard Trans Am engine, which was a carbureted Chevrolet 305 cubic inch V8, making 145 horsepower. Interestingly, you could only get a manual transmission, and a 4-speed manual at that, paired with the carbureted V8, not the Crossfire injected V8, where you were forced to get the 3-speed automatic. On the inside, the Firebird featured aircraft-in-style detailing as well as gauges with a curious mix of both fake and real Torx head screws, adding to the effect, and also making it interesting to service the vehicle, as you have to understand which screws are real as well as which are fake. Otherwise, you risk snapping the fake ones off and creating a more haggard look to your interior, shall we say. A very large instrument panel top pad, similar to that introduced in the 1979 Eldorado and 1980 Seville, allowed the sunlight to be blocked from hitting these large gauge faces that were presented in front of the driver. An owner could equip their Firebird any way that they wanted with a bevy of luxury features, everything including power windows, power locks, power seats, air conditioning, and special Viscount interior bucket seats, which would be 1 year only offered in 1982, which had the little PMD or Pontiac Motor Division logo in the middle of them, as well as a special cutout style headrest that was integrated into the seatback design. There was also an option that dressed up the rear compartment with carpeting on the sides of it, as opposed to just acres of plastic, and a lockable storage compartment. If you wanted performance, you could check the box for the WS6 option, which included 4-wheel disc brakes, larger 215/65/15 Goodyear Eagle GT radials, and 15-inch cast aluminum wheels, as well as stiffer springs and thicker front and rear sway bars, and a 12.7-to-1 quick ratio steering gear, as well as limited slip rear. In fact, during this period, Pontiac had not planned for the Trans Am to be the volume seller of the three models, and the Trans Am with the WS6 package became so popular that Pontiac had to create a WS7 package, which was effectively the WS6 package excluding the rear disc brakes because it ran out of rear disc brake packages. To that point, at the end of the run in 1982, the Trans Am sold almost 53,000 units, compared to the SE selling 23,000 units and the base Firebird selling 42,000 units. So what's it like to own one of these early third-generation Firebirds? And I say early because as the car evolved throughout its lifetime into the early 1990s, it became significantly better, materially so. But living with a 1982 Trans Am certainly has its quirks, and I've owned one for over 15 years. I will say that my relationship with my personal 1982 Trans Am is one that is best characterized by both love as well as hate. I will say that on the love side, I absolutely love the styling of my 1982 Trans Am. Today, it's just so rare to see a sports car with anything other than a wedge shape and rising belt line and huge wheels. And this 1982 Trans Am is just the antithesis of that. It has a beautiful proportions, wonderful, extreme tumble home on the body sides, where the roof is so much narrower than the midsection of the body, and then the body beautifully tucks under the midsection, creating this very athletic shape. I also love the basket handle behind the passenger seats, and the draped form rear glass, which was particularly difficult to execute and had a very high scrap rate during the era. And it also proved a bit prone to shattering if people slammed the trunk lid. In later years, Pontiac and Chevrolet both added a trunk pull-down motor to the rear hatch so that individuals were not incentivized to slam it to close it. I also have to say I'm a sucker for the asymmetrical hood scoop and pop-up headlamps, and unfortunately during the day, most often you'd see one headlamp raised on these, or none of them, or both of them, because of the complex system of relays that General Motors employed on these, as well as the plastic gears in the motors. Not sure why they ended up executing this design that way, but they did. Overall, I think the car is just a styling masterpiece, and somehow it looks perfect with 15-inch wheels and looks wonderful to me with the bowling ball hubcaps, which I also have to make sure that I secure with silicone so that they don't fall off when I go around a corner very fast, as was typical back in the day. On the hate side, I would say, is really the mechanicals, as this is not a well-engineered or well-manufactured vehicle, although, as I said, it did admittedly get better over time. These early third-generation Firebirds and Camaros are highly known for squeaks, creaks, rattles, everything from the T-tops, chirping, leaking, to the rear hatch in particular rattling. And overall, they just don't have that solid feeling that gives one a sense that they bought a high-quality automobile. I can also say that this is one of the few cars that I've ever had where I've gone up inclined driveways where one wheel is on the inclined driveway, one is still on the street, and I can visually watch the center console rock a little bit back and forth, all due to the flexibility of the body. I think GM took weight savings and the desire to save weight in this car to the absolute extreme in terms of engineering. And of course, under hood, the Turbohydromatic 200 transmission, 1 year only in 1982, is less than a robust unit. I've never had to rebuild the unit in mine, but I also don't really floor it at all. And if I do, I make sure that I let off the upshift just to ensure that I preserve the transmission's life. And the Crossfire injection V8 under hood certainly has its niggles and issues. You have to make sure that there are no vacuum leaks on it, including the throttle shaft bushings, and that the throttle bodies are synced correctly, and that all the engine sensors are working right and the fuel injectors are not dripping or leaking. So it requires some, shall we say, special attention. This car was also made during an era where General Motors had power windows that moved up at about the speed of a tortoise or maple syrup in winter, and you just kind of learn to live with it over time. But that said, I've owned my 1982 Trans Am longer than any other classic car that I have owned otherwise. So that, I guess, says something about the vehicle and whether or not I fall on the side of love or hate. But I will say the love side is purely due to the design. I'll also mention that the 1982 model has a lot of 1 year or 2 year only content, including the center console shifter, which was 1 year only, the Viscount bucket seats, also 1 year only, the bowling ball hubcaps, which are 2 years, 1982 and 1983, and for better or worse, the lack of a high output V8 also was a characteristic feature of the 1982 Trans Ams, as in 1983 they would get an optional high output 305 V8,
making 190 horsepower.
Overall, I would say the 1982 Firebird, SE, and Trans Am are some of the best-looking vehicles that General Motors produced in the 1980s, and it's unfortunate that their mechanical underpinnings weren't quite up to the standards that the design itself was. However, that's part of automotive history. Let's close out with this ad from 1982 highlighting the Trans Am.
Feel the anticipation in the pit of your stomach because you're about to take the first real drive in your new Firebird Trans Am. Your pulse quickens as the exhilarating 5-liter V8 comes to life. Now the road beckons, and freedom is just a few miles away. The moment you've been waiting for is here. Pontiac. Now the excitement really begins.
Thanks again for watching this feature on the 1982 Firebird SE and Trans Am. Hope you enjoyed it. Until next time, take care. Thanks again for watching this feature on the 1982 Firebird SE and Trans Am. Hope you enjoyed it. If you did, Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, as that really helps the YouTube algorithm serve this up to more people like you. And until the next video, be sure to check out the video thumbnails at bottom left and right for some suggestions for you. And until then, take care.